supposed to, there we go. So Muhammad bin Qasim is supposed to be the first Muslim who arrived on the borders of South Asia or Al-Hind. And when did he arrive? Someone else? $710, $712. Yeah, around that area. Actually, we are, his professional historians are now more or less agreed on 711. Where did he come from? Arabia. Okay. Iraq, more likely. Who sent him?
हज्जाज बिन यूसुफ।
वो कौन थे?
वो एक वायसराय या गवर्नर टाइप के थे
कहाँ
इराक
के?
वाली तरफ।
सॉरी, कहाँ के गवर्नर थे?
मशरकी सूबा जहाज जितने भी थे उमवी सल्तनत में।
हाँ, तो उमैया सल्तनत क्या थी?
ये मतलब खिलाफत थी जो कि हज़रत अमीर मुआविया के बाद जो है ना एक किस्म की मोरूसी बन चुकी थी, और फिर अब्दुल मलिक बिन मरवान और उसके जो बेटे थे वो उसको हेड किया करते थे।
Did everybody catch that? Would anybody like to add to it? Who did Muhammad bin Qasim represent? The Umayyads, yes, that's right. And what do we know about the Umayyads? Can somebody quickly look up some dates for me? For the Umayyads? Yeah, have we got anything? Right, 661 to 750 CE. Now this is kind of, it's not strictly the timeline for South Asian history, but we do want to be aware of major trends in world history that collide with South Asian history or have an impact on it. 661 to 750 AD is correct. What was happening before 661 in the Islamic world? I'd actually love to hear from somebody. Ayaz, would you like to speak and tell us a little more?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
I think, ma'am, when Islam was arrived in Saudi Arabia in 521, I don't know the exact date. And after that,
let's first remember that it was most definitely not Saudi Arabia, right?
Okay, I think Makkah, ma'am.
हाँ, सऊदी अरेबिया कब बना? बहुत हाल में, जब इब्न साउद की फैमिली आई।
Yes, ma'am. And after this, ma'am, there were four, descendants, you can say, of Holy Prophet, peace upon him. Abu Bakr, Umar Farooq, Usman, and Ali. And so these ये जो चार मतलब वो थे साहबा थे, तो उन्होंने जो है ना रीन किया, मतलब उन्होंने फिर नबी सल्लल्लाहु के बाद जो है ना वो फिर इक़्तिदार में रहे, और यूं जो है ना खिलाफत राशिदा रही, और फिर आगे जाकर ये कुछ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हुए, उसके बाद उमैया का वो शुरू हुआ डायनेस्टी।
ठीक है।
So So all I know is this.
It's all right. It's all right. Okay, so Umayyads का capital कहाँ था?
शाम
शाम कहाँ है? Damascus. So Damascus is the name of a city, which is the capital of present-day Syria. Sham is the Arabic word for that entire region, which we call Greater Syria. अब सीरिया के आसपास बगल में बहुत से छोटे-छोटे ममालिक हैं, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. All of that was Greater Syria. And all of it was called Sham. So Damascus was the Umayyad capital city. And who established Damascus as the capital city for the Islamic Empire?
हज़रत अमीर मुआविया
Muawiyah. Because before that, what was the official capital city for the Arab state, Muslim Arab state?
मदीना
Medina. In the middle, a few other cities were temporary capitals. Does anybody know?
कूफा एंड बसरा
बिल्कुल. Kufa कहाँ है?
it is in Iraq.
It is in Iraq. And whose capital was Kufa?
हज़रत अली
Yeah, why?
क्योंकि जब वो मतलब इख्तलाफ हो गया हज़रत अमीर मुआविया और हज़रत अली के दरमियान, तो फिर कुछ कहते हैं कि मतलब फ़ौजी इमदाद के लिए वो मतलब कूफा की तरफ चले गए थे, क्योंकि वहाँ के लोग अक्सर सिपाही थे और इस वजह से उन्होंने वहाँ पर मतलब दारुल हुकूमत बना लिया था.
अच्छा, जब I'm sorry, I'm really making you guys excavate your memories. We did talk about this briefly though last time, so I will ask you, when the Arab Muslims, after they had been united under the banner of Islam and absorbed into an emerging Muslim state, they erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula and very quickly conquered large parts of Asia proper. What were the first two major areas that the Muslims conquered? Persia, okay, but not all of Persia. The Persian Empire was really big. Turkey? टर्की तो काफी दूर है यार, अभी नहीं पहुंचे थे. और टर्की में ईस्टर्न रोमन एम्पायर कायम और दायम था. Syria and Iraq. Thank you, Josefa. Syria and Iraq. All right. Now let's attempt to go back to my maps, which is what I've been trying to do, which will make, there we go. That's not the ones we want right now. Okay, that helps you understand a little bit. Now, this whole huge landmass, ये जो पूरी चीज surrounded by the Red Sea on one side and the Persian Gulf on the other, this whole thing is called the Arabian Peninsula, just like this is the Indian Peninsula. A peninsula means a large piece of land jutting out into the sea so that it is surrounded by water on three sides. It's not an island because it's not surrounded by water on four sides, but It is surrounded by water on 3 sides. It's just a geographic term. So this whole thing is the Arabian Peninsula. And just this little strip over here, which is the northwestern edge, the northwestern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, this strip is the Hijaz. What was underneath here? See, I think we can. Yeah. So here's a bigger view. This is modern, of course. That's why this is Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is its very modern name when the House of Saud came to power as the monarchs of this region now called Saudi Arabia. ये areas बहुत ज़रूरी थे. Yemen and Oman was more or less part of Yemen through most of pre-modern history. Why are they important? Because actually in the 7th century is the 600s, which is the lifetime of the Holy Prophet and the Khulafai Rashidun and the beginning of the Umayyad Empire. So in that period, these southern areas of the Arabian Peninsula were much more advanced than the deserts or the Hijaz, for 2 reasons. One, they were not desert, right? Yemen is partly desert and partly green agricultural land. And of course, they are at the tip. They're right at the edge facing the open ocean. And they developed sea trading economies very early on, like as early as the 1st century AD. They were Islamicized quite early, of course, and just continued as Muslims to ply their sea trade. Now, to be clear, again, more geography, the difference between the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. Seas are usually the water bodies that are close to continental land, that have shores. And then as they drop away into the vast open ocean, you get names for oceans. Does anybody know how many oceans there are in the world? Because there really aren't that many. We're getting numbers from 5 to 7. Can anybody quickly name the major ones? Indian, Pacific, Atlantic, Southern, yeah. Arctic. Okay, we are primarily concerned at any time in this course with 2 major oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian. The part of the Indian Ocean which surrounds जी बेटा
Miss, I think Arabian Sea भी तो है. I think ये fall करता है इस category में.
नहीं, यही तो मैं भी आपको अभी 2 मिनट पहले मैंने आपको क्या कहा है?
Indian Ocean, okay.
नहीं, उससे पहले क्या कहा है? What is the difference between the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea? Anyone? Can somebody help Laiba out? What is the difference between the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea? Ji Javeria.
I think you mentioned that the sea is close to continental land and that it opens into the ocean.
That's right. Okay. So seas, look at this, right? Here you have the Laccadive Sea. Here you have the South China Sea. But all of these feed into the Indian Ocean, which is the large ocean in between Africa, Asia, and this is Australia down here. Okay, so you know that most of the Earth's surface is covered by ocean, right? But you don't call it ocean till you're well out, far from land, from continental land. Ji, Sara.
Oh, sorry, Miss Galdi, sir.
Okay. But don't get confused. When you're reading, when I'm talking, we will often be talking about the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And in our context, right, studying the history of South Asia, these more or less mean the same thing. They mean all the water surrounding the Indian Peninsula, which human beings have used for sea trade to get on boats and go from one place to another. So this is more or less a quick bird's eye view of the Arab or Middle Eastern sea routes to India. निकलते यहीं कहीं से थे. Anybody know what is over here where my cursor is? यहाँ क्या होगा?
Oman.
ओमान में क्या?
बंदरगाह.
कौन सी? I think someone said it. It's one of the oldest. Muscat is one of the oldest port cities in the world because of its location here. Okay. Yes, UAE वगैरह भी यहीं कहीं है. But ये मस्कत से ज़्यादातर सब निकलते थे. और यहाँ on the Persian side of the Persian Gulf, you had Hormuz. And they would go along the whole coast. Ye pura ek Makran coast, which was raided constantly. Do you see now how close it is? And then this long part of the Indian Peninsula on the western side, yani hamari taraf, is called the Malabar Coast. So the Makran coast and the Malabar coast were very familiar places to Arabs long before our friend Muhammed bin Qasim. Does anybody know where in South Asia the first Arab and then Arab Muslim communities actually settled? सबसे पहले अरब मुसलमान हिंदुस्तान में कहाँ आके बसे?
I think Gujarat.
It's a good guess. Anybody else have any other guesses? Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan. Yes, the Makran coast is definitely very early in the game because they used to raid it all the time. Sindh. I mean, by now, the fact that I'm asking the question, you should know that it probably wasn't Sindh and it probably wasn't Muhammad bin Qasim, right? That is just part of our official narrative. Banaras, Shahan, Banaras is in the landlocked center of North India. Sri Lanka, not a bad guess. They came to this, the Malabar Coast. Acha, now this is a very interesting thing that, again, more geography. We all know about the monsoons, right? We experience them, if not every year, at least once every few years. But the entire region experiences them. Does anybody know what causes the South Asian monsoon?
Winds from the Mediterranean, when wind from the Mediterranean Sea, they rise and they come to South Asia and उधर से फिर वो summer monsoon होती है और बे बंगाल से जब हवाएं उठती हैं तो वो जब आती हैं तो winter monsoon होती है.
Well, one rising in the east and one rising in the west. That's right. So, of course, these guys in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and by our time 7th century, were all using sailboats, right? Sailboats use wind power. Large cloth sails capture and harness the power of the winds to move. And what these guys discovered was that they could actually ride the monsoon winds. When the winds were going, and they come actually from the Indian Ocean, more like from down here, but it's more or less an east to west and a west to east direction, although it's thoda sa northeast and southwest. Anyway, they used the west to east winds to sail to the subcontinent, and then they had to hang around and wait for the east to west winds to go back. और ये पूरी जो सारे आप लाल लकीरें देख रहे हैं ना, ये सारा zone is connected by sea. All the way from, see, these were the big ports. Here in Tanzania, this little inlet, Zanzibar. Zanzibar is an ancient port. Aden, right here. This is the Gulf of Aden. Then Muscat. यहाँ इन जगहों से निकल के, अब देखो अगर यहाँ से निकल रहे हो ना, you follow the winds and the sea route. By the way, you can't just sail everywhere on the sea. I mean, I'm not at all nautical or naval, but there are actually special, more navigable pathways, even on the open ocean, and less navigable pathways. And sailors figure those out quite early. So there was this, it was almost like a sea highway. और देखो ये hit होता था नीचे. ये tip of Indian Peninsula पे इस वक्त क्या है? Like, what is this region? Does anybody know? Like, what is the modern
Tamil
name
Nadu.
of this region? Close. What is even further south?
Kerala.
Kerala, right? Kerala. So Kerala is a really, really interesting place because the Indian Ocean monsoon winds would land anybody coming to the subcontinent, mostly at the tip, even if they were coming from these areas. यहाँ पे पहुंचते थे. So this part of the Malabar Coast had a very, very early population of immigrants and traders coming from the Middle East and settling. So for instance, some of the earliest and oldest Christian communities outside of the Christian heartland of Palestine are to be found in Kerala. And similarly for Muslims, this is where they landed. What else is special about the Malabar Coast? ये इंडिया जाते क्यों थे? क्या ट्रेड करने जाते थे? लेने क्या जाते थे?
Spices.
हाँ, कौन सी स्पाइस? बिल्कुल सही है, स्पाइसेस. मगर एक खास
Turmeric and
नहीं, एक खास स्पाइस है जो यहाँ की है, उसको ब्लैक गोल्ड कहते थे ये लोग, because it was that valuable. Cinnamon is a really good guess, but cinnamon is actually from Sri Lanka. Black gold.
Kali Mirch.
काली मिर्च. Yeah. काली मिर्च लेने जाते थे. So from the early 7th century, probably from before the actual advent of Islam or the mission of Rasulullah, you have Arab traders trading with this part of the subcontinent. They became Islamized very quickly, along with the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, right? That happened in the Prophet's lifetime, more or less. And जो भी बचा कुचा रह गया था या जो कन्विंस नहीं हुए थे, वो अबू बकर के ज़माने में उनसे निपट लिया गया था. They were not missionaries, Umair. They were traders coming for black gold or pepper. Muhammad bin Qasim was also not on any kind of conversion mission. We must be very clear on the reasons why these people arrived. So the traders arrive here. And because they're dependent on these monsoon winds, they've got to spend a bunch of months sitting there. And what they started to do was marry local wives. They married Indian women on the Malabar Coast. And over time, slowly, these Indian women and their communities were acculturated or incorporated into the fold of Islam. I want to show you something else. Okay, we'll have to wait a moment for that.
Pondicherry is also in Kerala.
Huh? Someone speaking? Yes, Pondicherry is on the eastern side. Was the area more populated with Buddhists, as we discussed? Certainly the area that is called Sindh was more populated with Buddhists. I'm going to go back to the maps because what I was trying to show you has not loaded yet. Kahan gaye? Haan, ye. This is more or less the a kind of a political map of the wider region in the late 7th, early 8th century. And as you can see, the area called Sindh is much larger than the present day province of Sindh. And this part, which is southern and central Punjab, was called Multan. The whole region was called Multan, and Multan was considered a sub-region of Sindh. So ye pura region, which is almost commensurate with modern-day Pakistan, with the exception of all the northern areas, was called Sindh. And then beyond Sindh was Hind. और मकरान कोस्ट जो है ना यहाँ तक चलता चला जा रहा है. अच्छा. These guys, all the way up to this very large Hindu Shahi dynasty's kingdom, this area had a very strong Buddhist presence. Many Buddhist dynasties had ruled various parts over the centuries. There were large Buddhist communities. There were many communities that practiced various hybrid and syncretic forms of religion that were mixtures of Vedic religion and Buddhism. Jain the bahut. तो ये वैसे ही काफी cosmopolitan mixed जगह थी. There's a lot of historical speculation that Debal and Mansoura, which were the areas first in which the Umayyad province of Sindh was set up, were largely Buddhist, but we don't really know for sure. Okay, these are the old names. Anyone know what this is called now? And what is this? Where my cursor is?
Thatha.
हाँ, उसके पास क्या है? ये क्या है? Why is this famous? Because this is part of, or should be part of your historical knowledge. Debal. What is Debal? Bambor. Thank you, Ursel. And what is Bambor? What is Bambor? Why is it famous? That's right. That was thank you, Ursel. That was the portal or the entryway for Muhammad bin Qasim and his armies into the large region of Sindh. And there's a very interesting excavation site there even now. It's been over restored, which is always a bit of a pity, but anyway, it's there should anybody ever wish to go see it. Acha, now pay attention to this. This actually, they went further inland, and this became, Al-Mansura became the capital of the Umayyad province of Sindh. Why? Because they needed to be a little further inland as they expanded all the way to Multan. They also went to what they called the region of Turan. ईरान के बिल्कुल साथ साथ बलूचिस्तान का जो एरिया चलता है वो उसको तुरान, ईरान और तुरान कहते थे. So Kandabil and Makran all became part of the larger Arab province of Sindh. Now, does anybody know why Muhammad bin Qasim came? Actually, just for fun, I had been doing some internet browsing on that. And there is one website I want to share with you. Give me a sec. While I do that, do tell me, why is Muhammad bin Qasim said to have arrived?
Maybe to have control over the spice trade.
Okay, it's a very sensible reason. Umair, no, that's not Umair. Who just said for prisoners? And what somebody said that? Could you speak? Prisoners वाली बात किसने की है?
वो मैम अयाज मैंने.
तो क्या मतलब?
What I have learned from history. Okay, ma'am. At that time, the Muslim from Iraq, from eastern areas, they used to trade with Sri Lanka, and from returning to from Sri Lanka, and they were going in ships, I think, to Iraq, and then the Raja Daher, the के उसके आसपास के इलाके में जो डाकू थे, जो रेड करते थे लोगों का, तो उन्होंने उन मुसाफिरों को जो ट्रेड करने आए थे उनको जो है ना, आई थिंक उनको कैदी बना दिया. उनमें औरतें भी थी शायद. और फिर इजाज बिन यूसुफ ने मोहम्मद बिन कासिम को ये कहा कि पहले उन्होंने एक दो और भेजे वहां से रूलर्स, मगर वो यहाँ आकर उनको जो है ना शिकस्त दे दी यहाँ डाकुओं ने या फिर राजा दायर के जो भी थे. तो फिर अगली तीसरी दफा आई थिंक इजाज बिन यूसुफ ने मोहम्मद बिन कासिम को कहा कि आप जो है ना इनको चढ़ने के लिए जाएं. और फिर इस पर मोहम्मद बिन कासिम ने राजा दायर से रिक्वेस्ट भी आई थिंक की थी कि आप जो है ये इनको छोड़ दें. तो हम राजा दायर ने कहा कि इन डाकुओं पर मेरा कोई वो नहीं है, मतलब आई कांट डू दिस. सो आई थिंक उसके बाद फिर जो लड़ाई शुरू हो गई उस तरह ही वाज डिफीटेड बाय मोहम्मद बिन कासिम. एंड देन मजीद फिर डिफीट होते रहे यहाँ पर और इस तरह. यस,
थैंक यू Ayaz. Okay, can I have a volunteer who will read the first paragraph of this web page out loud for us? Vanya.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but be louder.
Okay, all right. The rise of Islam in India began with the conquest of Sindh, one of the provinces of the present-day Pakistan and also one of the oldest Indus Valley civilizations, by the Arabs. Among the Muslims, the first to conquer the territories of India were the Arabs. They, by spreading Islam, attained their political and religious unity in India. The conquest of Sindh was successful after a number of attempts. It was under the leadership of Muhammed bin Qasim that Sindh, then a part of India along the Indus River, now in Pakistan, was conquered. Muhammad bin Qasim was an Umayyad general who conquered the Sindh and Punjab regions at a very young age of 17. Even today, Sindh invasion is considered as one of the world's historic marvels as it led to the spread of Islam in South Asia and the Muslim communities in India. Today, Sindh is given the nickname Bab-e-Islam, the meaning of which is the gateway of Islam.
All right, thank you. So there are two things, right? Two correctives that we must make note of. This is the standard narrative, right? We are all very familiar with this narrative of Sindh as the Bab-e-Islam and Muhammad bin Qasim as the Fateh who opened the Bab. The first point to note, and that's the story I'm going to get into further, is that Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sindh in 711 is most certainly not the first arrival of either Muslims or the message of Islam to the subcontinent or even to Sindh. Sindh में भी पहले से थे, साउथ इंडिया में तो थे ही, 100 साल पहले से थे, सिंध में 50 साल पहले से थे. ठीक है. दूसरा ये that the Umayyad state, Muhammad bin Qasim, the later governors of the Umayyad province of Sindh, it was not their policy to seek active conversion of the local populations under their rule. This is something that is not really known or understood well about the early Islamic states. Neither the Khulafai Rashidun, nor the Umayyads, nor the Abbasids were particularly interested in or committed to mass conversions or proselytization of Islam amongst conquered populations. No such thing ever happened. बहुत आहिस्ता आहिस्ता सदी बसदी लोग खुद अपनी मर्जी से मुसलमान हुए जब वो तैयार थे, and through various other means, never ever ever by state propagation. There are many states, religious states in the history of humanity and the history of the world where active conversion to a state religion was forced or enforced by the state, but the early Islamic empires were not among these states. Why? There are many reasons. One of the reasons, of course, is that it was genuinely, this tenet was held sacred, that you could not and must not ever coerce anybody to change their faith. It kind of was defeated the purpose. But on the more practical side, it was more lucrative to have a large Zimmi or non-Muslim population because they paid higher taxes. So the way that the early caliphate and the caliphal empires of the Umayyads and the Abbasids functioned was there was a core elite composed of pure-blooded Arabs by lineage, or at least those who had an old Arab nisba, preferably a Qurayshi nisba. And they were employed, they had sort of direct access to all the best employment in the government, and they did not pay taxes. They were the recipients of the taxes paid by the large conquered non-Muslim populations. So, therefore, Muhammad bin Qasim, with an Umayyad army at his back, did not arrive in Sindh to convert non-Muslims to Islam. The protection of trade routes was an important consideration. Wasn't this discrimination a subtle way to convert non-Muslims? Yeah, eventually, but in the beginning, only other elites gave in to this. बाकियों को तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता था ना कोई खास encouragement होती थी for commoners to convert, because it was much more lucrative for them to remain protected peoples. Zimmi ka matlab bhi yahi hai na in Islamic law. And it was an arrangement that worked. The Arab Muslims were the protectors to whom protection tax was due. Yes, they pay jizya. That's right. The jizya is the protection tax. The Zimmi populations pay jizya, which is the protection tax. It was usually at a higher rate than zakat. And yes, you're right, they did not pay zakat. Muslim populations paid zakat. But as I said, jizya was more lucrative. All right. The other reason, and perhaps the more immediate reason, that Muhammad bin Qasim, and in fact, Muhammad bin Qasim probably wasn't that important, right? He was the nephew of Hajjaj, from whose territories the invasion was launched. So he was probably an honorary or titular head, a bit like, I don't know, a bit like Bilawal 5 years ago. Somebody else was doing all the work. He had a bunch of seasoned generals and statesmen with him who were actually handling the invasion. Sarim, wouldn't that limit human resources for Muslim armies? Actually, Muslim armies started to recruit professional soldiers from non-Muslim backgrounds very early, and they were not asked to convert. They were just professional soldiers paid to be in Muslim state armies. The more immediate reason that Muhammad bin Qasim seems to have turned up in Sindh is that Sindh was on the edges. It was on the edges of the Umayyad Empire, which extended up to Iraq and Iran, right? And it was an area that, as I said earlier, already happened to be very cosmopolitan and rather laid back, and full of lots of small kingdoms where the rulers and the communities had a wide variety of different religious and political inclinations. These types of places often tend to provide safe havens for people running away from large centralized states like the Umayyad Empire. So Sindh mein mid-7th century onwards, mid-7th century, which is when the first raids on the Makran coast are dated back to, the Arabs were raiding the Makran coast. Raiding means they'd come, they'd loot, they'd make some money, and they'd go back. They weren't interested in staying or conquering. But what they did do, even at that time, was marry Sindhi women, right? So you get a lot of major Arab tribal families with Sindhi mothers from quite early on, from the time of the Khulafai Rashidun, actually. And you get Sindhi soldiers recruited into various parts of Arab Muslim armies. There's a record of a brigade or a contingent of Sindhi Jats who would have had their own kind of proto-Indic forms of religion at the time, because Jats were pastoral nomads. Anyway, there was a contingent of Sindhi Jat soldiers in the armies of Hazrat Ali when he fought the major Battle of the Camel against Hazrat Aisha, Talha, and Zubair. So that's really early in the day. But that is on historical record. And they were picked up by one of Hazrat Ali's generals, Al-Hakim bin Jabala al-Abadi, who raided the Makran coast probably around the year 649, and he seems to have picked up this contingent of mercenary soldiers. Anyway, so all of these little bits and bobs of historical evidence tell us, paint a picture that's rather different from the conventional narrative that you and I are exposed to, that Muslims were coming to parts of Sindh and the Makran coast from a lot earlier than 711, and that there was a considerable exchange of people, and with people, what happens? Ideas come and go. Does anybody know which, and I've just given you one indication, one example, what kinds of rebellions and even civil wars plagued the early Islamic state, both under the Rashidun and under the Umayyads? जी हुज़ैफा.
Civil war?
मगर किस किस्म का, मतलब उसका generally what was the root of the problem? झगड़ा क्या था?
इनमें एक ख़ारिज भी थे जो कि मतलब
वो थे
दोनों
कौन?
पार्टीज के मुखालिफ थे, यानी ना हज़रत अमीर मुआविया की तरफ
ओरिजिनली किसकी पार्टी में थे?
हज़रत अली की तरफ थे।
हाँ।
और फिर जब उन्होंने सुलह की और फिर वो सारा मामला हुआ जो मतलब, तो उन्होंने कहा कि यह आपने गलत किया है, कुरान के जो हुक्म है उसके ख़िलाफ़ है और आप काफिर हो गए और हम भी काफिर हो गए, तो फिर वो अलहदा हो गए थे। लेकिन उनके बाद भी जैसे हज्जाज बिन यूसुफ का दौर और फिर उसके बाद भी बहुत अरसा इन्होंने बहुत तंग किया खुलाफा को।
ठीक है, but yes, most of you have put your finger on it. There were a series of armed conflicts. Civil war to major nahi hua after the final settlement, kya kahein, but basically after Karbala. I think that was just such a big shock to the system that that kind of confrontation, major confrontation between those who believed that the rightful succession to the leadership of the Muslims should go to Ali, and those who were content with the way that it had happened, right? And as you, I'm sure you all know, the word Shia in Arabic just means partisan, and the Shi'at Ali is the party or the partisans of Ali, those who supported Ali. That's where it comes from, Shi'at Ali. So Ali ke supporters में भी बहुत किस्म के लोग थे. There were those who believed only in the claims of Ali and his family through their direct connection to the Prophet via Fatima. And so the line of Hassan and Hussein had their share of followers. But then Ali actually had a bunch of new wives after Fatima died and loads of children from them. Some of his sons from other wives claimed to be the rightful imams and caliphs at different junctures in the 7th century, and would mount armed rebellions against the Umayyad state. So even after Karbala, this sort of just continued. कभी मदीना में हो जाता था, कभी बसरा में हो जाता था, कभी कहीं. And these rebellions were always suppressed by the Umayyad state. But one of the places that the different kinds of Shia rebels would come and hide was Sindh. And at this point, Sindh was not part of the Islamic Empire. It was on the fringes, but it was a friendly territory that was open to trade, that was tolerant of diversity, and that more or less welcomed all of these Shia Arab refugees. So the immediate cause for Muhammad bin Qasim to arrive in 711 in particular, वैसे तो जैसे मैंने कहा सिंध पे raids कई दफा हो चुके थे, was that they were chasing down a bunch of recent Shia rebels. That's why they came. There were other good reasons for doing this, right? If it had been a really bad idea for other political reasons, they probably wouldn't have done it. But it seemed like a more or less smart idea to just annex Sindh. उससे दो फायदे होते हैं इनको, और हुए. वो that further end of the Arabian Sea Indian Ocean trade route would become more secure. And this place that was so easy to run to and hide for rebels would now become part of the Umayyad Empire and directly administered by the empire. And so it would be harder for rebels to find refuge here. So these were the two solid reasons for to mount a full-on conquest of the larger area of Sindh. Did anybody know any of that from before? Or had heard anything about it? Ji Josefa.
जी मैंने इसका पढ़ा हुआ है काफ़ी, तो जो मतलब ये बागी वगैरह जाते रहते थे आगे पीछे, उसके बारे में। और फिर जो अरब के वहाँ बागी थे उन्होंने फिर एक किस्म के ट्रांसलेटर का काम भी किया था राजा दायर के पास और आगे पीछे जितने भी थे उनके पास।
Acha, and you also get in the old Arabic texts are records of this period, 7th century mein, 7th mein, 8th mein nahi. Muhammad bin Qasim is 8th. Late 7th century onwards, you already get important people from Arab tribes, Qurayshi Arab tribes, who take on the last name of that indicates they were settled in Sindh. They would either become Al-Sindhi or Al-Mansuri from Mansura and so on. So that is a major indication of Arab Muslims settled in Sindh long before Muhammad bin Qasim arrived. And they remained. What is interesting is, ek dafa wahan Umayyad governor bitha bhi diya gaya. The 2 or 3 Umayyad governors who came right in the beginning, they don't actually seem to have made a particularly serious effort to hound out all the Shia Arab rebels. They in fact formed alliances with them. There are also stories of at least one of them practically converting and becoming a card-carrying Shia and helping the rebels. So a bunch of things were going on here that are rather different from the conventional narrative. Now to go back to my point about how it was never the business of the state in the early centuries of Islam to mount any kind of state-sponsored conversion drives. So conversion karta kaun tha? Do you know what the word is, by the way? जिसको हम mission अंग्रेजी में missionizing या missionary activity कहते हैं, उसको हम अरबी इस्लामिक कॉन्टेक्स्ट में क्या कहते हैं? तबलीग तो अब कहते हैं, बहुत मॉडर्न लफ्ज है तबलीग. हाँ सारिम जी,
दावत देना.
Dawat, right? So the Urdu word dawat, which means invitation, comes from the Arabic word dawa, and dawa means to invite to the faith. और जो दावा करता है वो दाई होता है, which is a word that is now associated only with Ismaili Shia missionaries, but actually in the early days of Islam was associated with a wider range of missionary activity. So 7th or 8th century में जितना दावा हो रहा था amongst common people, amongst common non-Muslim populations in all the vast regions that had become part of the Islamic Empire, especially in Umayyad times. All the dawah was, well, I would say like 95% of the dawah amongst non-Muslims was led by different factions of Shias, because it was in their interests. What are they trying to do? They're trying to overthrow the Umayyads. They're trying to assert what they feel is the righter, purer succession to the Prophet, the more Islamic succession and the more Islamic state, right? So, but they're weak, right? They're weak. They're not part of the state. They are hounded by the state. And therefore, it is in their interests to actively seek new supporters. And they were very successful. So there was a reasonably successful Muslim dawah in the areas of Greater Sindh in the 7th and 8th centuries, and then get carried on right up to Mahmud arriving. But even in Iraq, Iran, Syria, there was a decently successful dawah. It was on the successes of various Shia dawah activities across the Islamic world, क्योंकि इतने सारे लोग एक शिया आउटलुक और मतलब मुहिब्बे अहले बैत बन गए थे, without necessarily having become, you know, what you might consider proper Muslim. It was on the support of those people who had been called to Islam by Shia Dais that the Abbasids mounted their revolution. It all culminated in that. So in 750, a family who actually isn't descended from Ali, but rather claim descent from the Prophet's uncle Abbas, nevertheless kind of appealed to this widespread popular support for the Shia worldview, where somebody from the Ahle Bayt should be officially in charge. And a lot of their soldiers were also recruited in this manner. So in 750, there was a successful armed overthrow or coup of the Umayyads in Damascus, and the Abbasid dynasty was established. The Abbasids, however, played both sides to some extent. To mount the revolution and to recruit supporters, they played on Shia sensibilities, but once they came to power, very quickly they reinvented themselves as the champions of a more Sunni version or tradition of Islam. I'm sorry, it's a very confusing lesson in early Islamic history, but all we need to take away from it is 2 points. Is that in Sindh, there was a slow spread of Islam, not through Muhammad bin Qasim or the Umayyad state, but through Shia rebels running away from the Umayyads who came and settled there and who actively sought converts and supporters. Secondly, even earlier than these Arab Shia incursions and settlements in Sindh were the Arab traders settled in the southern tip of India around Kerala. I want to talk a little bit about them because we're never going to visit them again. There's a very just cool history to them. Today, and for a rather long time, the Arab Muslim communities settled along the Malabar Coast, or Zahir ab to Arab nahi rahi na, because I told you they were marrying and setting up homes since they spent so much time there, you know. And there are now very large Muslim populations in those parts of India. In fact, the modern Indian state of Kerala has I think like a 26-27% of the population is Muslim, and it's a very old Muslim population. They are by and large referred to by the name Mapela, जिसको अंग्रेजों ने मुपला बना दिया था. So the Mapelas of southern India have left a lot of traces of their time there. Give me a second. This, of course, it's completely most rebuilt, but this is the site of what is more or less agreed amongst historians as the oldest mosque in South Asia. And it is in Kerala. It is said to have been built around 629 AD. That means in the Prophet's lifetime. I'll come back to that. This is another one of the older mosques in Kerala, not as old as that one, which means more of the original structure is there. This is about 1,000 years old. I hope you notice the absence of minarets. The style of architecture here is very South Indian. It takes a lot, borrows a lot from the temple and palace architecture of South India, because ज़ाहिर artisans तो वही थे ना, कारीगर और मजदूर तो भर भर के किश्तियों में नहीं ला रहे थे अरब, वहाँ locally इस्तेमाल किया था. This is a beautiful interior shot of the Jama Masjid in Kottayam, which is supposed to be 9th or 10th century. A lot of wood, a lot of carved wood. This is their equivalent of a minar. It's the sort of steeple at the top, decorated much the way their temples are decorated. Oh, that's nice. This, by the way, is the rebuilt fort at Bhambor, but it's built around this थोड़ा सा कम करें, central chamber. This round central chamber was first excavated, and this was what was more or less intact. और ये जब सबसे पहले excavate हुआ था 19th century में, it was a British team. They found an inscription in the ground that said Imam al-Baqir, indicating that there had been some presence in this area of supporters of the 5th Shia Imam al-Baqir. So this is all there. You can go to Bhambur and see it. But back to the Mapelas. In the local languages spoken in Malayalam and older forms of Malayalam, which is the language spoken around Kerala and the Malabar Coast, Mappila means son-in-law. It means damad. It is today the word used for the entire Muslim community of that region, but originally it meant son-in-law. And you can like it's beautifully logical. Why? Because वो अरब मुसलमान दामाद आते थे और चले जाते थे, monsoon winds के साथ आते थे और फिर monsoon winds के साथ चले जाते थे. Many of them had two families, one on the Arab side, one on the Indian side. Sorry, I'm just checking into the chat. Anybody have any questions? I can't open the chat. Makli is a graveyard, yes, and it's older than Makli, but Iman, what you see at Makli and even Chowkandi, which is right outside Karachi, is the same sort of architecture that has been uncovered at the original sites like Bambur and Mansoura. Because the decoration of the graves or the tombs in these graveyards is very elaborate, and it's the same stuff that is used on the architecture. Ifra. So rebel Shias brought Islam to this region, and then those Shias converted to Sunnis. No, they did not. It is the Abbasids who, and there's no conversion. We will not talk about conversion. We will talk about acculturation. Because जो हमारा मॉडर्न आइडिया है कन्वर्जन का ना, कि एकदम से आज मैंने फैसला कर लिया है कि मैं ईमान ला रही हूँ और मैं मौलवी साहब के सामने जाके कहूँगी ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह मोहम्मद रसूलुल्लाह और मुझे सर्टिफिकेट मिल जाएगा और इस तारीख को मैं मुसलमान बन गई, right? Did not happen that way. It did not happen that way, and there were no such rituals. It happened, by and large, it used to happen over many generations. You know, there would perhaps, if we look at the Mapalas, a particular coastal tribe would welcome the Arab traders in. They would allow them to marry their daughters. The Arab traders may or may not have asked their wives to convert. In fact, by and large, they didn't, because ज़रूरी नहीं समझा जाता था. अब हमारे यहाँ पाकिस्तान में कहते लॉ है कि वो अहले किताब होनी चाहिए, लेकिन इतना भी नहीं होता था उस वक्त. Wives could be from any background. So, and even if they weren't wives, they were taken as legal concubines, which kind of comes to the same thing, because legally a man owes them the same rights and their children are legitimate, but they definitely did not need to convert. So Indian women from the Malabar Coast would marry Arab traders. They'd have children. Some of their sons might join in the sea trade with their fathers. They would start visiting the Arab Muslim heartlands. They would get more and more exposed to Arab Islamic culture. They would probably behave as Muslims when they would be on that end of the sea journey. And when they came back, they would probably behave and conform to the cultural norms of their mother's Mapila culture. But over a few generations of this kind of thing happening, you would find that a Arab Mapila household or clan would have become more and more acculturated into Islamic beliefs and Islamic practices. तो को एक झटके में नहीं होता था. So I think we can leave it at that for today. I'll share a few things with you if you have more interest in this. But the purpose was just to tell you a story about how Islam and Muslims really came to settle in the subcontinent. And it was these 2 points that were the entryways. Sindh perhaps does not deserve the title of Bab-e-Islam, and that Babul Islam should really be the Malabar Coast in Kerala. Sindh came second. Any questions? नहीं, सबको सब कुछ समझ में आ गया. यमुना कह रही सबको सब कुछ समझ में आ गया.
Yes, I have a question.
जी Ifra, and then Jyoti.
So
We've heard that Muhammad bin Qasim used to plunder lands and he looted villages and temples. So what is all that about? Like, where does this idea that he did all of that comes?
Muhammad bin Qasim.
Yeah.
He did do a bit of it, and that's just part of military raiding. Everybody did it to everybody else. It's also a little bit of us projecting back a certain image of Muhammad bin Qasim onto the historical figure. Just and he shares a lot of these traits with Mahmud, this mapping back of things that were probably not true of the men themselves. He would have raided temples and destroyed villages as his army was passing through areas. And we don't need to interpret that as some kind of Islamic zeal. It is just sort of standard military practice. Rahma? Sorry, Jyoti and then Rahma.
Hi, Miss. I don't have any specific question about today's lecture, but I'm struggling with the timeline actually. So when we started from Muhammad bin Qasim and I think last week's discussion, so I'm struggling with the timeline. Like I was actually focused more on the reading and today's discussion, so I'm really struggling with that.
All right. Okay, Jyoti. Rahma?
It's okay.
Noted.
Assalamu alaikum, Miss.
Ji Islam.
I had a small question. So,
Yeah.
wasn't the cultural exchange between the Arab Muslims and the people of Sindh mutual, in the sense that why do we consider the integration of Islam in the lives of the people of Sindh stronger than the other way around?
It's a good question. And the reason it eventually came to be that way is that right from the word go, right from the 7th century onwards, the more dominant world civilization was that of Islam. So it had military, political, economic, and intellectual power on its side. That's really what happened. And then, of course, as I had said in the beginning, these regions, and I think Sufia has just asked this question, was a big hodgepodge of different religious traditions. There were pockets of Vedic Brahmanism, there were Jains, there were different types of Buddhists, there were kind of Vedic Buddhists. It was not straightforward, and it never became straightforward. It's never been straightforward. There's always been immense diversity and complexity in religious beliefs and practices in the subcontinent, but also, please note, also across the larger Islamic world. In fact, that diversity in the Islamic world itself came with Islam to the subcontinent, because that's what you see playing out in Sindh. Anyone else? All righty, I'm going to give you a timeline today, a basic one, so that you know where you are generally. But when you're lost, I do strongly encourage you guys to maintain timelines of your own. If I say something like Abbasid, Umayyad, you should, if you don't know what it is, or you don't know what the dates are, look it up. That's why I encourage you to do that at the beginning, to just like look up Umayyad Empire, and then you came back with 661 to 750, right? Now you have a period. So always do that.